When the fighting stopped across the European continent, thousands of soldiers from the defeated Wehrmacht found themselves packed onto vessels crossing the Great Ocean westward. The month was June in that year of 1945, and the war that had consumed the world was finally drawing to its bitter conclusion. These men, who had fought from the frozen steppes of Russia to the bocage hedgerows of Normandy, now stood on crowded decks watching the American coastline emerge from the morning mist. They had been seized in battles across France, pulled from the collapsing Ruhr pocket where hundreds of thousands surrendered in a matter of weeks, and gathered from the Gothic line in Italy, where the mountains had finally broken their resistance. Now they were being delivered to places whose names meant nothing to them, camps scattered across the heartland of their enemy's territory. The ships docked, and the prisoners descended gangplanks onto soil they had never imagined touching. Guards directed them into trucks and trains that carried them deeper into the American interior, through landscapes vast and seemingly endless. Kansas received its share, as did Texas with its scorching plains, and Iowa with its rolling farmland stretching to every horizon. When the transport vehicles finally stopped and the gates of the prisoner-of-war camps swung open, the Germans filed through with the exhaustion of men who had travelled too far and seen too much. Dust rose in clouds around their worn boots, kicked up by thousands of feet marching in loose formation. The uniforms they wore hung from frames that had grown thin during the final months of combat, when rations became scarce and supply lines crumbled under Allied bombardment. Weeks of reduced food had left its mark on every face, in the hollows beneath cheekbones and the way their belts had been cinched tighter and tighter. Yet something remained intact despite the hunger and the defeat. It sat in the set of their shoulders, in the way the officers held themselves apart from the enlisted men, in the glances they exchanged when American guards gave orders. Arrogance had survived where empires had fallen. This was particularly true among those who had held rank, the lieutenants and captains and majors who had commanded men in battle and still believed that certain standards separated the civilized from the barbaric. They gathered in the barracks that first afternoon, settling onto bunks and speaking in low voices about what awaited them in this strange land. The Americans, they agreed, were a young nation without the traditions that gave life its proper shape and meaning. These were people who had grown powerful through industry and numbers, not through the refinement of culture or the discipline of true military tradition. It was during one of these conversations that word filtered through the compound about the evening meal. The Americans, a sergeant informed them, would be feeding the prisoners in something they called a cafeteria. The word itself provoked immediate reaction. Laughter erupted in several of the barracks, spreading from bunk to bunk as men repeated the strange term to one another. A lieutenant who had grown up in Hamburg and remembered the grand restaurants of that port city before the bombing began, shook his head with undisguised contempt. He announced to anyone within earshot that such a word could only refer to the most common sort of establishment, perhaps a grimy tavern where dock workers gathered, or possibly the kind of institutional dining room where school children were herded through lunch periods. The very sound of it, he insisted, revealed everything one needed to know about American understanding of proper dining. His voice carried across the barracks as he warmed to his theme. Americans, he declared with the certainty of a man who had never set foot in America until his arrival as a prisoner, understood nothing of what it meant to sit at table with dignity. Their entire civilization was built on speed and noise and the vulgar pursuit of quantity over quality. Their meals, he continued, were surely as crude as the films that had occasionally made their way to German theatres before the war, all gunshots and car chases and simple-minded plots. Everything about American culture was loud, cheap, and without substance. Several of his fellow officers nodded in agreement, adding their own observations. Only in the fatherland, one stated, had the art of dining been preserved in its truest form. Even in the midst of war, even when resources grew scarce, the German officer corps had maintained standards. Dignity at table was not negotiable. What made this performance of superiority particularly striking was the gnawing emptiness in their bellies as they spoke. The truth that none of them wanted to acknowledge directly was that many months had passed since any of them had eaten what could properly be called a full meal. Bread had become a precious commodity, doled out in portions that grew smaller as the Reich's supply system collapsed. Potatoes, when available at all, were rationed with careful precision. Meat had become almost a memory, something recalled from earlier years when the Wehrmacht still controlled vast territories and could draw supplies from occupied lands. The final winter of the war had been particularly brutal, with soldiers scrounging for anything edible while the civilian population at home faced starvation. Yet pride, somehow, had remained nourished even as bodies wasted. The memories they clung to were of better times, of officer mess halls in peacetime garrison towns, rooms panelled in dark oak where meals were served with ceremony. They remembered white tablecloths, always crisp and clean, and the way sausages would be arranged on platters with geometric precision. Wine bottles were opened with ritual, the cork extracted carefully, the first pour offered to the senior officer present. These meals had never been merely about sustenance. They were performances of hierarchy, demonstrations of the order that the military system imposed on the chaos of existence. Every gesture at table had meaning, from the moment officers entered the dining room to the final toast before departure. It was theatre, in a sense, but theatre that reinforced identity and belonging. For these men, dining represented something fundamental about what they believed made their nation superior. Order and discipline were not merely military virtues, but civilizing principles that extended to every aspect of life. The table was where these principles became visible, where the difference between the cultured and the primitive was made manifest. They assumed with complete conviction that the Americans possessed none of this understanding. America was a nation of immigrants and mongrels, a place where different peoples had been thrown together without the binding force of true tradition. How could such a society possibly understand the importance of proper dining etiquette? What these confident, hungry men could not possibly have known was the scale of the system that awaited them. While they had been fighting their losing battles across Europe, while their homeland's economy crumbled and supply networks failed, the United States had been building something unprecedented in human history. By 1944, the Quartermaster Corps of the U.S. Army had perfected logistics that would have seemed fantastical to military planners from any previous era. The achievement was not merely feeding American soldiers deployed across 3 continents, though that alone would have been remarkable. The system had been designed with such excess capacity that it could simultaneously supply millions of prisoners of war, enemy soldiers whose nations had sought America's destruction, with regular abundant meals. The numbers told a story of agricultural and industrial might that defied easy comprehension. In that single year of 1944, American farms had produced more than 24 billion pounds of meat. The figure was so large as to be almost meaningless until one tried to imagine it, the sheer mass of cattle and pigs and chickens raised, slaughtered, processed, and distributed across vast distances. Flour mills throughout the heartland had worked ceaselessly, grinding out more than 120 million barrels of wheat flour. Trains longer than some European towns thundered across the Midwest, carrying milk and vegetables and sugar, hauling the bounty of a continent-sized nation that had never seen war on its own soil. The production was relentless, industrial, and seemingly limitless. What the German prisoners were about to encounter was not the ritual and refinement they valued, but something entirely different. It was scale, pure and overwhelming. It was the demonstration of what industrial democracy could achieve when fully mobilized, when every farm and factory and rail line worked in coordination toward common purpose. But sitting in those barracks on their first afternoon of captivity, the Germans knew nothing of this. They continued to laugh and make jokes about what surely awaited them, imagining tin cups filled with watery soup, perhaps a slice of dry bread handed out by guards who viewed them with contempt. They pictured themselves eating like cattle, standing in mud, no chairs, no tables, no dignity whatsoever. A young private, barely 20 years old, muttered to the man on the next bunk that the Americans would certainly make them suffer through meals designed for humiliation. One pot for everyone, he suggested. One spoon, perhaps, nothing that might remind them of their former status as soldiers of a great power. Even hunger, which had been their companion for so many months, could not quite silence the smugness that coloured these predictions. They believed, with an intensity born of desperation, that America was too crude and too brash to understand what a meal should truly mean. The nation was rich in resources, they acknowledged, but poor in spirit. It had power but no soul, abundance but no culture. And so the stage was set in those late afternoon hours, with the sun beginning to sink toward the western horizon. Sneering prisoners sat on wooden bunks, their stomachs hollow with hunger, their bodies weakened by weeks of inadequate rations, yet wrapped tightly in the arrogance that was perhaps the last possession their defeat had not stripped away. They waited for the evening meal with a mixture of hunger and disdain, certain that what came next would confirm every prejudice they held about their captors. Behind the cafeteria doors that they would soon be ordered to enter, under the bright electric lights that illuminated every corner of that space, waited not the humiliation they expected, but something that would echo in their memories for decades, something that would shake the foundations of their certainty more thoroughly than any battlefield defeat had managed to accomplish. The first night in the camp passed as such nights always did, with the peculiar mix of exhaustion that follows long travel and the resentment that comes with captivity. Men slept fitfully on thin mattresses, their dreams troubled by memories of combat and uncertainty about the future. But when morning came and they began to stir, to sit up on their bunks and face another day as prisoners, they carried with them something that sustained them perhaps more than they realized. It was pride, but pride of a specific kind, rooted not in recent victories, for there had been none, but in the deep memories of what they believed made their culture superior to others. What they missed most acutely was not the thrill of combat or the camaraderie of the front lines, but the ritual of the German table. In their minds, polished by nostalgia and the human tendency to remember the best while forgetting the worst, even the simplest military mess hall back home had carried with it an air of ceremony that elevated eating above mere animal necessity. There had been order in every gesture, they told themselves and each other. Officers were always seated first, their rank acknowledged even in something as basic as the serving of a meal. Hands were folded before eating began, a moment of silent acknowledgement before forks were lifted. Sausages and cabbage, when available, were served with measured portions, each man receiving his due according to his station. They remembered the sharp sound of boots crossing polished floors, the smell of tobacco smoke curling through the air after meals were finished, the way silence would be enforced until the senior officer present lifted his fork to signal that eating could commence. These memories were cherished and repeated because they represented more than food. They represented hierarchy made visible, discipline enacted through daily routine, and identity confirmed through shared ritual. Even in defeat, even sitting in an enemy prison camp thousands of miles from home, these men clung to the belief that German meals were sophisticated affairs, reflections of a culture that valued form and propriety above the crude and noisy habits they imagined dominated American life. In the barracks, as men prepared for whatever the day would bring, conversations circled endlessly around these themes. A captain from Bavaria, a man who had commanded troops through multiple campaigns and still carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to obedience, reminded the younger soldiers that Americans thought quantity was the same thing as culture. He spoke with the weary patience of someone explaining obvious truths to those who might not yet fully understand. The Americans, he insisted, believed that having more of something made it better. They confused size with sophistication, abundance with achievement. The Germans, by contrast, even when bombs fell on their cities and supply lines were cut, had preserved the dignity of dining. Linen cloths were used when possible, even if they had to be washed and reused until they were threadbare. Toasts were raised to fallen comrades, maintaining traditions even in the darkest hours. Rules governed the table because the table was an extension of the officer corps itself, a place where rank and respect were continuously performed and reaffirmed. For this captain, and for many who listened to him, the scarcity of food in Germany during the final years of the war had only made these rituals more meaningful, not less. When food is abundant, he suggested, eating requires no thought, no discipline. But when every potato and every slice of bread is precious, when hunger is constant companion, then the act of eating becomes a performance of pride, a declaration that we remain human and civilized despite circumstances that might reduce others to savagery. The younger prisoners nodded as they listened, finding comfort in these familiar ideas. Some thought of their homes, of mothers who had somehow managed to lay out steaming potatoes on chipped plates even during the worst of the rationing, of fathers who sliced bread with deliberate, almost ceremonial care, making the meagre portions seem more significant through the attention devoted to it. These memories, burnished by distance and need, carried with them an aura of superiority that the men were reluctant to question or abandon. Germans had always eaten with more refinement than others, they believed. It was part of what made them German, this attention to proper form, this insistence that even basic activities like eating should be conducted according to standards that elevated them above the merely functional. The word cafeteria still sounded foreign and faintly ridiculous when they spoke it, and they used the term mockingly, as one might describe a carnival booth or a feeding trough. They could not imagine, sitting there in the morning light filtering through barracks windows, that within hours this cherished pride would begin to falter, that the careful rituals they remembered and celebrated would seem to crumble when confronted with something larger than etiquette. What these men did not yet understand, what they lacked the context to grasp, was that America's strength lay not in ritual, but in abundance, not in hierarchy, but in scale. For the German prisoners of war, this would prove to be the cruelest twist of memory imaginable. The tables they longed for, with all their rituals and pride and careful observance of rank, would suddenly feel small, almost fragile, almost pathetic when confronted with the bright, roaring democratic machinery of an American cafeteria. The comparison was not one they wanted to make, but it would be forced upon them nonetheless, and once seen, it could not be unseen. And so they waited, these proud and hungry men, lined up as ordered, their stomachs growling with the insistence of bodies that had been underfed for far too long. They waited still certain that they knew what it meant to dine with dignity, still unaware that the next door they would be ordered to pass through was not just a mess hall or a feeding station, but a mirror that would reflect the true difference between two worlds, two systems, two visions of what society could achieve. They stood in that line with their memories and their pride, and they had no idea what was coming. The midday whistle cut across the camp, sharp and insistent, and guards began calling for the prisoners to assemble. Rows of weary Germans shuffled forward, their boots scuffing against the gravel pathways between barracks, the sun overhead glaring down with the intensity of a Kansas summer. They followed the line as directed, most of them still expecting something crude, perhaps a large pot of thin stew being ladled into dented tin cups, maybe a piece of hard bread distributed by guards too busy or too indifferent to care about anything beyond completing their assigned duties. The prisoners had prepared themselves mentally for humiliation, for a feeding process that would strip away any pretense of dignity and reduce them to the status of animals being given their daily rations. Yet as they turned the corner following the guards' directions, what awaited them looked nothing like what they had imagined. The cafeteria doors swung open, and the prisoners at the front of the line froze so abruptly that those behind nearly stumbled into them. Before their eyes stretched a hall that blazed with electric light, so bright after the dimness of the barracks that some men blinked and squinted. Rows of polished tables gleamed beneath fluorescent bulbs, their surfaces spotless and shining, their arrangement precise and orderly. Along one entire side of the hall ran the serving line, and what a serving line it was. Stainless steel counters reflected the heat rising from great pans of food, surfaces so clean they caught the light and threw it back in sharp gleams. Steam curled upward from trays of what appeared to be beef stew, and beside that, mountains of mashed potatoes formed white peaks that seemed impossibly abundant. Loaves of bread sat stacked higher than any prisoner had seen since before the war began, perhaps higher than they had ever seen in their lives. The sight was almost cinematic in its impact, so overwhelming that it seemed staged, as though someone had designed this moment specifically to shock men who had lived in shadows and scarcity for so long. Green beans glistened under the lamps, their colour vibrant and fresh. Cakes were arranged neatly in rows, their frosted surfaces catching the light. Pitchers of milk and coffee stood ready, waiting to be poured into cups, more pitchers than seemed necessary, as though shortage was a concept that had no meaning in this place. The air itself carried warmth and the rich smells of roasted meat and baked goods, scents that made saliva flood suddenly into mouths that had grown accustomed to the tasteless gruel of military rations stretched far too thin. For a long moment, silence fell among the prisoners, their arrogance faltering under the sheer sensory force of what confronted them. This was abundance on a scale they had not prepared for, generosity extended to defeated enemies that made no sense according to anything they understood about war and captivity. A young corporal, his voice barely above a whisper, spoke what many were thinking. This is for prisoners? He seemed unable to believe his own eyes, as though the food might vanish if he looked away and then back again. Another soldier, barely 20 years old and thin as a rail from months of inadequate food, blinked rapidly, his eyes moving from the bread to the meat to the cakes and back again, as though trying to inventory everything before it disappeared. Their eyes darted toward the guards, half expecting to see laughter or cruel amusement, waiting for someone to announce that this was a trick, that the real food would be brought out shortly, and it would be the thin soup they had anticipated. But the Americans simply gestured toward the trays with an impatience that suggested they had other duties to attend to, their manner businesslike and utterly casual, as though this mountain of food was nothing remarkable, as ordinary as sunrise, as though feeding prisoners this way was simply how things were done and required no comment or explanation whatsoever. The contrast was devastating in its implications. Only months earlier, some of these same men had stood in ration lines in Berlin or Munich or Hamburg, waiting for hours to receive a scrap of bread or a watery turnip soup that was more water than turnip. They had watched children with sunken cheeks fight over potato peelings, had seen women faint from hunger in the streets. The memory of that scarcity was fresh and raw, and now, in captivity, as prisoners of the enemy who had defeated their armies and occupied their homeland, they faced more food in a single glance than they had seen in weeks, perhaps months. The polished trays reflected not just steam and light, but an image of America itself. Industrial might translated directly into sustenance, power measured not in tanks and artillery, but in calories and cups of milk and slices of cake. Behind the first men in line, a Luftwaffe sergeant clenched his jaw, unwilling to let his troops see awe or weakness in his face. But even he faltered as the line was directed to move forward, and the clatter of steel trays being distributed rang through the air. For in that moment, the proud rituals of German dining that they had discussed only hours earlier, the memories of sausages and wine and toasts and enforced silence, seemed almost quaint, like relics from a different age, fragile and insubstantial when placed against the scale of this glowing hall with its endless abundance. The men stood on the edge of something more profound than hunger or its satisfaction. They stood before a revelation about power and capacity, about what different systems could achieve. And as they stepped across the threshold, as the first among them reached out to take hold of a shining American tray, they realized in some wordless way that what they had mocked only hours before was about to strip away the very pride they had carried with them across the ocean, the pride that had survived every battlefield defeat and every surrender. The cafeteria was a weapon, though none of them would have used that word, and it was about to demonstrate its power. The line shuffled forward with the uncertain rhythm of men still processing what they were seeing, each step echoing against the spotless tile floor that gleamed under the merciless brightness of electric bulbs. The guards distributed trays, cold steel placed into hands, still uncertain whether this was real. and pointed toward the counters with gestures that were almost bored in their routine casualness. What happened next would bewilder the Germans more than any weapon they had faced during years of combat, more than the massive bombing raids that had flattened their cities or the endless columns of enemy tanks that had crushed their defences. There was no single pot into which food was dumped without ceremony or choice. There was no officer barking orders about who would eat first and who would wait. Instead, they witnessed an orderly flow that operated on principles entirely foreign to their experience. Each man walked forward individually, slid his tray along a metal rail that ran the length of the serving line, and made choices. He could take a spoonful of potatoes, or he could decline. Beef stew or chicken, the decision was his. A slice of bread and then butter if he wished, or jam or both. Again, his choice to make. The rhythm was mechanical, efficient as a factory production line, yet strangely democratic in a way that troubled something deep in their understanding of how things should work. This was nourishment delivered through a system where each man became, however temporarily, the master of his own decisions. One prisoner muttered in disbelief, "We may choose," as though speaking the words aloud might help him comprehend what was happening. The guard merely nodded, not understanding German but recognizing the tone of surprise, and gestured for the line to keep moving. Another German prisoner whispered to the man beside him that this was how American soldiers themselves were fed, and the idea struck them with more force than the smell of roasted meat or the sight of fresh bread. Choice had been a privilege they had not imagined would be extended to prisoners, to defeated enemies. In the Wehrmacht, rations had always been handed down without question or consultation. You ate what was given to you, when it was given, in the portions determined by those above you in rank. No discussion, no options, no individual preference considered. Here, in captivity, in a prison camp surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, they were being confronted with the freedom to decide between cornbread and biscuits, between carrots and beans, between coffee and milk. Some hesitated as they moved along the line, reaching toward food and then pulling their hands back, as though taking too much might expose some trap, might reveal this whole display as an elaborate cruel joke. A few looked back nervously at their comrades before finally scooping gravy onto their plates, seeking permission or reassurance from their fellows before acting on their own judgment. But as the line continued its forward movement, as man after man made his selections and moved toward the tables, hesitation gradually gave way to something closer to wonder. Trays filled with food that steamed and looked genuinely appetizing, colourful and abundant, as though the very concept of hunger had been not merely addressed, but banished entirely from this place. It was as if scarcity had been defeated here, declared obsolete through sheer productive capacity. The irony was brutal in its clarity. Back home in Germany, families in every city were surviving on meagre slices of bread that had to be stretched across entire days. Children shared watery soup that barely deserved the name, fighting over every spoonful. Women traded jewelry and family heirlooms for potatoes and flour. Yet here, the defeated enemy, men who had fought to destroy America and everything it represented, could select between multiple options, could exercise choice in a matter as fundamental as what to eat. The act was so simple that it seemed to shake the very foundations of their notions of superiority and civilization. The cafeteria embodied something they had not prepared themselves to encounter. It was abundance directly linked with liberty, however small and temporary that liberty might be. Each tray represented a silent lecture, a demonstration more powerful than any speech or propaganda that in America, even prisoners were granted the dignity of choice, were treated as individuals capable of making decisions about their own needs. It was democracy translated directly into food and the process of feeding, a weapon deployed without gunpowder or explosives, yet no less devastating in its impact than artillery or aerial bombardment. As they sat down at the long tables, forks clattering against trays as men who had not held such utensils in months remembered how to use them properly, the prisoners glanced at one another with expressions that mingled unease with disbelief. Pride and confusion tangled in their throats, making it difficult to swallow the first bites even as hunger demanded they eat. One man whispered to his neighbor that they had all thought the Americans would humiliate them, had prepared themselves for degradation and deliberately cruel treatment. "But what is this?" he asked quietly. "If not humiliation of an entirely different kind, a humiliation that came not from cruelty but from generosity, not from reducing them to animals but from treating them better than their own nation had managed to treat its civilians?" For the first time since their arrival at the camp, the laughter that had filled the barracks during the previous night's conversation was completely gone, replaced by a silence heavy with implications that the men were only beginning to process. In its place came the quiet confusion of men being forced to see freedom and power, not in the grand abstractions of speeches or banners or military parades, but in something as mundane and undeniable as the steaming haze rising from their own plates, in the simple ability to say yes to green beans or no to mashed potatoes, in the revolutionary notion that even defeated enemies retained some small measure of human dignity and individual choice. The first bites silenced the room in a way that orders never could have accomplished. Forks scraped gently against trays as the men tasted what they had mocked only hours earlier, and the sound was almost reverent in its quietness. A private from Bremen, a man who had not tasted real meat since the brutal winter of 1944 when the rations had dwindled to almost nothing, closed his eyes as the beef stew coated his tongue, and his expression suggested he might weep from the sheer unexpected pleasure of it. Another soldier, deeply sceptical of the pale spread someone had identified as peanut butter, dipped a piece of bread into it cautiously, grimaced at the unfamiliar taste, then to his own surprise found himself reaching for more, intrigued despite his suspicions. The initial sneers that had greeted the very concept of a cafeteria dissolved into hurried chewing, into the mechanical action of feeding bodies that had been denied adequate nourishment for far too long. Eyes darted around the tables to see who would admit it first, who would be willing to acknowledge that the food was not just edible but actually good, that the Americans had not served them garbage or slop, but genuine, well-prepared meals that exceeded anything they might have reasonably expected. Within minutes, the careful order of the serving line began to break down in ways that revealed just how deep the hunger ran. Men who had finished their initial portions rose awkwardly from their seats, trays still clutched in their hands with an almost possessive grip, and drifted back toward the counters with expressions that mixed shame with desperate need. The guards looked on with faint amusement, clearly visible on their faces, as the same Germans who had laughed at the very idea of American cafeterias only hours earlier returned for second helpings, some even attempting thirds when they could manage it without drawing too much attention. One Luftwaffe officer, a man known for his rigid bearing and stern discipline, muttered to his comrade in a voice kept deliberately low, "In Germany right now, even civilians are starving in the streets, while here, even captives eat their fill." His words spread quietly across the tables, repeated like a confession that each man was reluctant to speak aloud but could not quite keep inside. The observation travelled from table to table, shared in whispers, and with each repetition it seemed to carry more weight, more terrible significance. The atmosphere in the cafeteria shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways as the meal continued. The first encounter with the food had been pure shock, the nervous system's immediate response to unexpected abundance. But the second helping became something closer to a surrender of pride, an admission that hunger mattered more than ideology, that the body's needs could overcome the mind's commitments. A sergeant who had spent the previous evening lecturing younger soldiers on the refinement of German dining traditions now shoveled cornbread into his mouth with boyish hunger that would have embarrassed him had he stopped to think about it. A young private licked frosting from his fingers with undisguised pleasure, whispering to no one in particular that the cake tasted sweeter than any ration his mother had managed to stretch across an entire month back home. In the barracks later that night, after the meal had ended and they had been marched back to their quarters, men laughed nervously, but the laughter was different now. They were not laughing at the Americans anymore, but at themselves, at how quickly their hunger had defeated their arrogance, at how thoroughly the experience of abundance had undermined their claims of cultural superiority. Yet alongside this uncomfortable self-awareness, other reactions festered and spread. Gossip moved through the bunks like a disease. Some muttered darkly that the whole display had been an elaborate trick, that the Americans had staged this bounty specifically to weaken German resolve, to make them grateful to their captors and thus more compliant. Others claimed that the United States was wasting food on a criminal scale while Europe bled and starved, and that such waste was itself proof of decadence, of a civilization that had lost all sense of proportion and propriety. But for most of the men, regardless of what excuses or explanations they offered to themselves and each other, the memory of that first cafeteria meal would not fade because it had filled not just their stomachs but their imaginations. It had created an image, a reference point, against which everything else would now be measured. They had seen with their own eyes what abundance looked like when organized on an industrial scale, and the sight had been genuinely awesome in the original sense of that word, inspiring awe and something close to fear. What these prisoners did not know, because they lacked the context and the information to understand it, was that United States agricultural production had reached unprecedented levels during the war years. In 1945 alone, the year of their capture, American dairy farms had produced more than 55 billion quarts of milk, a number so vast it challenged comprehension. Sugar beet fields stretched across the Midwest in what seemed like infinite expansions, white oceans of cultivated land dedicated to producing sweetness on an industrial scale. The cafeteria they had just experienced was not a performance staged for their benefit, not theatre designed to impress or intimidate. It was simply the byproduct of a system, the overflow of productive capacity that dwarfed anything Europe had achieved even in peacetime. To the prisoners, every slice of cake, every glass of milk, every second helping of meat and potatoes became proof of something they could barely articulate but felt deep in their bones. The war had been lost long before they surrendered, not on battlefields but in farmlands and factories, in the fundamental capacity to produce and distribute resources. Military defeat was merely the final acknowledgement of an economic reality that had already been determined. That night, lying on their bunks in the darkness, many men could not sleep despite their exhaustion. Arguments broke out in whispers, philosophical debates conducted by soldiers who had never considered themselves philosophers. Was America strong because of its weapons or because of its food? Could an empire built primarily on abundance ever be defeated by one that glorified discipline and sacrifice? Could superior culture triumph over superior production? A captain stared at the ceiling in the darkness, unable to answer any of these questions, troubled by doubts he had never expected to feel. The certainties that had sustained him through years of war were cracking, and the cause of that crack was nothing more dramatic than a hot meal served on a steel tray in a brightly lit room. By the second week, the routine of the cafeteria had become familiar, woven into the daily rhythm of camp life. But familiarity had not bred contempt or even indifference. The shock of that first encounter had not faded with repetition. Each day, the prisoners filed into that bright hall, took their trays, watched the steam rise from endless pans of food, and made their choices along the serving line. And each day, the experience reinforced the same uncomfortable lessons about power and capacity, about what different systems could achieve when fully mobilized. The arrogance that had once wrapped their shoulders like a protective cloak, that had insulated them against the full recognition of their defeat, had thinned thread by thread until even the proudest among them stood quietly in line without the sneers and commentary that had marked the first days. Pride was proving difficult to maintain when roast beef and coffee and cornbread sat waiting only a few steps away, when second and third helpings were available to anyone willing to simply ask or return to the line. One Luftwaffe captain, a man known throughout his unit for his clipped orders and disdainful gaze, for his insistence on proper military bearing under all circumstances, was spotted by his own men slipping back into the serving line for seconds. His troops watched in silence, a mixture of relief and discomfort settling over them like fog. The relief came from seeing that even their captain was human enough to surrender to hunger. The discomfort arose from witnessing the collapse of standards they had thought immutable. If even the captain could not maintain his dignity in the face of American abundance, what hope did any of them have? Another officer, a man who had spent the first evening in camp lecturing the barracks about American vulgarity and the importance of maintaining German standards even in captivity, now held his tray close to his chest like something precious as he balanced 2 slices of pie with visible care. Nobody mocked him for this reversal. Hunger had united them more effectively than rank or ideology or any speech about national duty ever could. The cafeteria had become a great equalizer, reducing all distinctions to the common denominator of empty stomachs and the human need for nourishment. But there was another layer to the cafeteria experience, another dimension that unsettled the prisoners even more deeply than the abundance itself. Behind the counters, serving the food with practiced efficiency, stood not just white American cooks in military uniforms, but African American mess workers, and sometimes women as well, all performing their duties with a matter-of-fact professionalism that took no notice of the Germans' discomfort. For men who had been fed years of propaganda about racial hierarchy, about the supposed natural order that placed different peoples in different positions of superiority and inferiority, the moment was profoundly shattering. To be handed food respectfully, to be served in silence by someone whom their nation's ideology had condemned as racially inferior, challenged fundamental assumptions in ways that direct argument never could have achieved. These were people, according to everything they had been taught, who should not even be capable of the level of organization and efficiency on display. Yet here they were, part of a system that functioned with mechanical precision, treating the German prisoners with neither special cruelty nor special kindness, simply doing their jobs as assigned. Whispers spread through the barracks that night, as they did after every unsettling encounter with American realities. Some men muttered about shame, about how far they had fallen to accept food from such hands. Others deflected, claiming it was just the American way of doing things, that the United States had different customs and standards that should not be judged by German measures. But the silence of many officers, men who normally would have been the first to speak and the loudest in their pronouncements, told its own story more eloquently than words. The cafeteria was not merely a place where hunger was satisfied. It had become a daily reminder that the world they had believed in, that carefully ordered universe of hierarchy and ritual and claims of superiority, was collapsing with every spoonful of stew, with every glass of milk poured by hands that should not, according to their ideology, have been capable of such simple competence. Statistics available to the camp administrators sharpened the sense of humiliation, though the prisoners themselves did not see these numbers. Each camp cafeteria had been designed to serve thousands of meals within a single hour, applying principles of assembly line efficiency to the problem of feeding large populations. At Camp Swift in Texas alone, records would later show that more than 20,000 pounds of flour were baked into bread each week, transformed into loaves that prisoners consumed with desperate gratitude. The numbers were staggering in their scale, relentless in their demonstration of capacity, undeniable in their implications about which nation could sustain itself and which could not. Where Germany struggled desperately to feed its own children, sending them into the streets to scavenge for scraps and beg for potato peelings, America fed its prisoners as though scarcity did not exist, as though the very concept of shortage was foreign to its experience. The comparison was devastating for anyone willing to think it through to its logical conclusions. As the trays clattered and the serving lines moved forward day after day, many prisoners found themselves lost in thought during meals, chewing mechanically while their minds wrestled with questions that had no comfortable answers. What did it mean to be fed so well by an enemy? Was this kindness, or was it domination dressed in the costume of mercy? Was it generosity, or was it a demonstration of power more effective than any weapon? A young corporal admitted in his private diary, which he kept hidden beneath his mattress, that he feared the food more than he feared the barbed wire surrounding the camp. The fence merely constrained his body, he wrote, but each meal seemed to weaken something deeper, eroding the certainties he had brought with him into captivity. He found himself forgetting his hatred a little more with each day, and this forgetting terrified him more than the prospect of remaining imprisoned. Autumn sunlight slanted golden across the camp when the cafeteria doors opened once more on an October afternoon, illuminating dust motes in the air and painting everything with the warm colours of a season turning. By this point, months into their captivity, the ritual had become as familiar as breathing. The shuffle of boots toward the hall, the gleam of steel trays catching the light, the rising steam of food prepared in quantities that still seemed excessive no matter how often they witnessed it. Yet something deeper had shifted in the prisoners over these weeks and months, a transformation that operated below the level of conscious thought. What had begun as laughter and contempt had turned first to awe, then to uneasy acceptance, and now lingered as memory being etched into the very marrow of men who had once sworn absolute allegiance to ideals that seemed increasingly distant and abstract. A grey-haired officer, a veteran of campaigns on the Eastern Front where he had witnessed horrors beyond description, sat quietly at a corner table with his tray before him. He held it as though it were some kind of relic from a future he had not anticipated, an artifact from a world that operated according to different rules than those he had learned. Before him lay mashed potatoes arranged in smooth white mounds, green beans that still retained their colour and texture, and a generous slice of chocolate cake that glistened with frosting under the lights. He ate slowly, almost reverently, as though each bite carried the weight of lessons he could not escape or ignore. Later, back in the barracks as evening settled and men prepared for sleep, he whispered to a comrade on the next bunk that the Americans won not only with their guns and their tanks and their airplanes, but with their fundamental ability to feed even their enemies. We were wrong to laugh at them, he admitted, his voice barely audible. We understood nothing. The cafeteria had become far more than a place to eat. It had transformed into a symbol, a kind of theatre where abundance was performed daily for an audience that could not look away. Its very mechanics, the steel trays sliding smoothly along metal rails, the milk jugs clinking as they were refilled, the loaves of bread stacked in what seemed like endless supply, all testified to something greater and more fundamental than mere taste or nutrition. It was industrial democracy in motion, a machine built not merely to prosecute war, but to nourish populations, to sustain entire societies without the constant spectre of scarcity that had haunted European civilization for centuries. For the Germans, prisoners who carried with them memories of a culture that prized ritual and form, it became impossible to ignore that such power made their own once proud traditions of wine and sausages feel like echoes from some distant and increasingly irrelevant past. The comparison was inescapable. What good were fine tablecloths and proper toasts when the fundamental task of feeding people could not be accomplished? What value did ceremony hold when children went hungry? Stories of the camps and the cafeterias began to spread beyond the barbed wire fences through the letters prisoners were allowed to send home, carefully censored but still capable of conveying basic facts. Some men wrote to wives or mothers, hinting in language that would pass the censor's review that captivity was less brutal than they had feared, that the Americans treated their prisoners with a restraint and even a generosity that defied expectations. Others remained silent, unable to articulate the shame they felt that their most haunting memory of the war was not the terror of combat or the grief of losing comrades, but the daily abundance of an enemy cafeteria, the humiliation encoded in second and third helpings freely given. The irony cut deep and left scars that would last lifetimes. The regime they had served had promised them supremacy, had insisted that German culture and German discipline would inevitably triumph over the crude materialism of democratic societies. But the lesson they carried home, the truth that would sit in their memories for decades, was the humiliation encoded not in cruelty but in generosity, not in deprivation but in plenty freely offered even to those who had sought their enemies' destruction. Years later, when the war had receded into history and these men had returned to Germany and attempted to rebuild their lives amid the ruins, these memories resurfaced with surprising power and frequency. Old men who had become grandfathers found themselves speaking less of battlefields and artillery barrages and more of meals eaten in an American prison camp. The stories they told their grandchildren were not the tales of glory and adventure that children expected from veterans, but quieter, stranger recollections that puzzled young listeners. A former soldier, now elderly and sitting in a comfortable chair in his small apartment, told his grandson not of the tanks he had faced or the artillery that had nearly killed him, but of the day he had mocked the concept of a cafeteria only to find himself standing in line for second helpings hours later. His voice trembled slightly as he described details that remained vivid despite the passage of decades. The clatter of trays, a sound that still sometimes echoed in his dreams. The flood of milk being poured into glasses, white and pure and seemingly inexhaustible. The sweetness of American cornbread, which he had never tasted before and had thought looked unappetizing until he tried it and found himself reaching for another piece. That image, he explained to his confused grandson, had revealed the scale of America's true power more clearly than any battle report or casualty figure. More than the crack of rifles or the roar of bombers overhead, it was the cafeteria that had shown him which side possessed the resources and the will to win a long war of production and attrition. The boy listened without fully understanding, puzzled that his grandfather's most powerful memory of the war involved food rather than fighting, unable to grasp how a meal could carry more meaning than combat. And so the story reaches its conclusion, not with the thunder of guns or the flames of burning cities, but with a quiet, persistent image that refused to fade from memory. A shining steel tray piled with food, sitting under the hard, unforgiving glow of electric lights that illuminated every corner and left no shadows where pride might hide. For the prisoners who had once scoffed and sneered and laughed at the very idea of an American cafeteria, it had proven to be a weapon more powerful than any cannon or bomb. A lesson delivered not through violence, but through generosity that somehow cut deeper than cruelty ever could. The truth they learned, the knowledge they carried with them across oceans and through the decades that followed, was that abundance itself could break down the walls of pride more surely and more thoroughly than any amount of force or coercion. A nation that could feed even its enemies, that could extend choice and dignity even to those who had sought its destruction, possessed a kind of power that military might alone could never achieve. It was the power of a system that had solved the fundamental problem of scarcity, that had organized its agriculture and industry so effectively that waste became possible, even routine. History teaches its lessons through many channels. Sometimes the lessons arrive with noise and drama, with the roar of cannons and the thunder of engines and the shouting of armies across muddy fields. But sometimes, as the German prisoners of war discovered to their lasting discomfort, history's deepest lessons come quietly, delivered in the clatter of trays and the rising steam of food drifting through a brightly lit hall. The story of German soldiers who once mocked American cafeterias only to stand humbly in line for second and third helpings reminds us across the decades that power expresses itself in many forms. It is not always measured in the destructive capacity of weapons or the tactical brilliance of generals. Sometimes the most decisive power is revealed in the simple, undramatic ability to nourish and sustain, to provide without fear of running short, to extend abundance even to those who have no claim to it beyond their basic humanity. For the men who lived through this experience, who passed through those cafeteria doors day after day during their months of captivity, the memory became sharper and more significant than many of their combat experiences. It stripped away comfortable layers of pride and forced them to confront how fragile ideology becomes when confronted with the ordinary abundance that well-organized democracies can achieve. The regime they had served had promised them many things. It had offered visions of supremacy and destiny, had insisted that discipline and order would triumph over the chaos of democratic societies. But in the end, that regime could not accomplish the most basic task of governance. It could not fill the stomachs of its people. America, with its vast fields that stretched beyond the horizon and its tireless factories that seemed capable of producing anything in any quantity, offered something their homeland could not provide. It offered a vision of plenty so vast that it extended even to enemies, a demonstration of capacity that made previous arguments about cultural superiority seem hollow and irrelevant. In the later years of their lives, when those prisoners had long since returned home to a Germany divided and occupied and struggling to rebuild from complete devastation, many of them carried this paradox within them like a weight they could never quite set down. They had been defeated utterly in war, their cities reduced to rubble, and their nation partitioned among the victors. Yet in captivity, they had been fed better than they could remember being fed in years, perhaps better than at any point during the entire war. They had laughed at the prospect of eating like children in some crude American mess hall, yet they had found something closer to dignity in the simple act of choosing their own portions than they had experienced in all the ritualized hierarchy of German military dining. And in the stillness that comes with old age, when memories of youth blur and details fade, it was often not the battlefield that these men spoke of when they chose to speak at all. It was the cafeteria, that bright hall with its abundance and its democratic chaos and its bewildering generosity. An old soldier, many years after the war had ended, remarked to a visitor that he could still hear the sound of trays sliding along the serving rail, the metallic scrape that had become as familiar as breathing during those months of captivity. Decades had passed, he noted with something like wonder in his voice, and still that sound remained clear in his memory when so much else had faded into confusion. To him, and to many like him, that sound carried within it a truth he had spent a lifetime trying to fully understand. That strength in the modern world is measured not only in weapons and soldiers, but in the quiet, relentless power of a society capable of feeding even its foes, of extending choice and sustenance to those who have earned nothing but imprisonment. The cafeteria had been a kind of classroom where lessons were taught without words, where the simple fact of abundance demonstrated what speeches and propaganda could never quite communicate. It showed that power in its most fundamental form is the capacity to provide, to sustain, to ensure that scarcity becomes the exception rather than the rule that governs daily existence. The prisoners who mocked American cafeterias and then stood in line for seconds learned this lesson despite themselves, absorbing it through their bodies even when their minds resisted. And they carried it home with them when the war finally ended and they were repatriated to a homeland that scarcely resembled the nation they had left. They carried it through the hard years of reconstruction, through the divisions and occupations and slow rebuilding of German society. And some of them, in their final years, found themselves thinking less about the grand ideological struggles they had been told they were fighting for, and more about the strange mercy of being fed well by an enemy who could have chosen cruelty instead, who could have reduced them to starvation but chose abundance instead, who demonstrated power not through violence but through the simple, devastating generosity of a hot meal served on a steel tray in a hall blazing with electric light.